In this video, we're going to talk about an introduction to vertebrates. So starting out, let's talk about the classification or taxonomy of vertebrates. You can see on this triangle over here that domain is the broadest level of classification. And then as you go through the kind of different layers or levels of classification, things become more and more specific until you get down to the species level, and every single type of organism has its own species designation. So vertebrates are in the domain Eukarya, and of course that means that they are made up of eukaryotic cells. Those are cells that have a true nucleus, and their DNA is located inside that nucleus. The DNA is also packaged in multiple linear chromosomes. The kingdom for vertebrates is Animalia, so we're talking about animals. And then the phylum is Chordata. And Chordata, if you remember from the invertebrate lesson, also includes some invertebrates, but then it also includes the vertebrates. Now you'll notice that here is a subphylum. So there are some organisms that have kind of additional levels of classification. So a subphylum would be kind of here between the phylum and the class. You can also have a superclass that exists above the class level but below the subphylum level. There are also some superphylums or superphyla. So you might see some of these words, and they're not on this pyramid because they don't apply to all organisms, but some organisms have these kind of intermediate levels of classification. So within this phylum Chordata, we're going to take a look at three subphyla. The first one is subphylum Urochordata, and this includes invertebrate chordates, which are also called tunicates. Subphylum Cephalochordata, which also includes invertebrate chordates known as lancelets. And then the subphylum Vertebrata, and these are probably the ones that you more likely think of when you think of a vertebrate. So the majority of this lesson is going to focus on these vertebrata vertebrates. So we can take a look at this phylogenetic tree that kind of outlines the classification of these different chordates. So you can see that we are kind of talking about deuterostomes. And if you remember from our invertebrate lesson, deuterostomes were part of that phylogenetic tree that we looked at there. So we're kind of continuing that line from the phylogenetic tree that we talked about when we talked about invertebrates. And actually you can see here that Echinodermata, these are invertebrates. And then we also have our Cephalochordata and Urochordata. And these are invertebrate chordates. And then the rest of the organisms are all vertebrate chordates. And we can further classify them or kind of break them down into fishes, amphibians, reptiles, and birds. We'll talk about why they are lumped in with reptiles later on. And then mammals. And remember that all of them here are the true vertebrate chordata. And I should clarify that echinoderms are invertebrates. They're also not chordates. All right, so they are included here because they share this common ancestor And they share this common characteristic of being deuterostomes, but they are not chordates. These are invertebrates that we talked about in the invertebrate lesson. You can also see on this phylogenetic tree the different structures that evolved that led to the branching of this tree. So you can see that we have this branch of the chordates, and then we've got the vertebrates with the vertebrata with the true vertebrates. And then gnathostomes, which just includes organisms that have a true jaw. The evolution of lungs, forelimbs or being tetrapods, having an amniotic egg, and producing milk. So we're going to talk about some of these adaptations as we go through our lesson. So some general characteristics of all chordates, or all of the organisms in the phylum Chordata. They are all deuterostomes. Remember, deuterostome means mouth second. And what that means is that this blastopore that forms during this process known as gastrulation is going to turn into the anus. When that blastopore continues to go through the gastrula to make almost like a donut with a pathway going all the way through, or a hole going all the way through, the other end is going to turn into the mouth. They are triploblastic, which means that they have three. So tri means three. So they have 3 germ layers. And these develop during that gastrulation. And you can see the 3 germ layers here. We've got an ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And this is the triploblastic example right here. Additionally, so this one is also triploblastic, but we're not going to look at that one because we are focusing on the coelomates. So remember that in this kind of middle picture here, we have the coelom, which is a body cavity. All right, so all of the chordates are deuterostomes, meaning that the blastophore turns into an anus first and then produces a mouth at the other end. They are triploblastic, meaning that they develop 3 germ layers during gastrulation, and they are coelomates, which is also known as eucoelomate, meaning that they have a true body cavity. And I'm going to cross out this one on the left here because this one is an acoelomate, meaning that they do not have a coelom. And this does not apply to our lesson here. So we are focusing on this middle one right here. All chordates have these 4 characteristics at some point in their life cycle. So it might not show up in the adult body form, but it does occur at some point, maybe in utero or during juvenile development, or it might develop as the organism develops into an adult form. So these 4 characteristics, the first one is a notochord. So these 4 characteristics include a notochord, a dorsal hollow nerve cord, pharyngeal gill slits, and a postanal tail. So let's start by taking a closer look at the notochord, as you can see here on this picture. A notochord is a flexible rod-shaped structure that runs along the back or the dorsal part of the organism. You can see that it's running kind of parallel to this dorsal hollow nerve cord, which we'll talk about on the next slide. And in vertebrates, it is actually going to develop into the vertebrae, and these are the bones that make up the vertebral column, also known as the spinal column. You could also just call this the backbone. The dorsal hollow nerve cord, as you can see here, it will develop into the spinal cord in vertebrates. And the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. And it is actually surrounded by the vertebral column, which is produced from the notochord. The pharyngeal slits, as we can see here. In vertebrate fish, these develop into structures that support the gills, and the gills are needed for respiration and gas exchange. In tetrapods, and when we talk about tetrapods, this just means organisms that have 4 limbs. And so we're going to be mostly talking about things like amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So in these tetrapods, these pharyngeal slits are going to develop into parts of the ear and the tonsils. And the tonsils are in the throat. And your ear actually drains into the throat as well. And if we look at this word pharyngeal, so the pharynx is the throat. And last but not least, all chordates have a post-anal tail. And it doesn't really show it here, but the anus would be somewhere like here, so the tail is beyond or past the anus. The tail contains skeletal, so things like bones or cartilage, and muscular components. And so in fish, it actually helps with swimming. So you're probably familiar with the fin that's at the back of the fish that they can move back and forth in order to swim through the water. In terrestrial species, so these are species that live on land, the tail can aid in balance. Now, you may be putting it together that humans are vertebrates and you don't have a tail. But actually in utero, so during embryonic or really fetal development, we do have a tail. It just goes away before we're born. So remember that these are characteristics that happen at some point in a vertebrate's life cycle, but it might not persist for the entire life of the organism. On the next couple slides, we are going to take a look at the invertebrate chordates. And the first one we're going to take a look at are those in the subphylum Urochordata. And these are also known as tunicates, which get the kind of the common name of sea squirts. And that's because when they are threatened, they can actually contract their muscles and they can squirt water out of them. The larvae of these animals are mobile, so they can swim around, but they are sessile as adults. So remember, sessile just means that they are fixed in place, so they are immobile. They do not move once they are anchored in place. They are filter feeders, and so they have the ability to essentially capture small organisms in the water and then digest those organisms for food. Now we're going to talk about another invertebrate chordate in the subphylum Cephalochordata. And these are also known as lancelets, and you can see a picture of it here. They are benthic, which means that they typically live or are found on the bottom of the ocean. And they are marine, which means that they are in the ocean. And they are filter feeders. So you can see in this picture here that they typically kind of bury their body in the sand, and then their head and tentacles stick out the top, and that allows them to catch food. So now we're going to move on to our main subphylum that we're going to be looking at for the rest of this lesson, and this is subphylum Vertebrata. And the general characteristics associated with all organisms in the subphylum are that they have a cranium, which you can see in this picture here. You might also think of it as a skull, but it's not always considered a skull because they come in different kind of shapes and sizes, and they might not be bony like a skull. So some of them are made out of cartilage, others are made out of a fibrous tissue. So the definition of a cranium is just a structure that surrounds the brain. Vertebrates also have a vertebral column, which you can see on this picture here. It includes this backbone, also called a spinal column. And the spinal cord is encased within the spinal column for protection. In the subphylum Vertebrata, we do have some different varieties. So we have fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And all of these are classified under the subphylum Vertebrata. Remember, they are chordates, so chordata is the phylum. And then more specifically, the subphylum is Vertebrata. And we're going to talk about each one of these in more details in their own videos.